Hi, and welcome to ArtLab, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast with me, Kamayani. Today we have with us comics maker, researcher, and arts educator, Ita Mehrotra. Her book, Shaheen Bagh, A Graphic Recollection, brought out by Yoda Press in 2021, is a response to the anti-CAA NRC protests spearheaded by Indian Muslim women in the Delhi neighborhood of Shaheen Bagh. It is in this locality, in the aftermath of police brutality at Jamia Millia Islamia University, that the first stirrings of a citizens' response to state violence emerged and then spread across India from December 2019 to March 2020, just before the COVID-19 crisis. As someone who was one among the many thousands of citizens who participated in protests against anti-constitutional laws, I felt that Ita's book, which is part chronicle, part commentary, and part diary, refreshed the memories of that turbulent period. 2 years on, with the Citizenship Amendment Act still standing and the National Register of Citizenship continuing to lead to detentions of Muslims in Assam, I thought to revisit the historic moment of Shaheen Bagh through Ita's visual depiction. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Hi, Ita. Thank you so much for joining us on ArtLab. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, thank you so much, Kamayani. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to have this conversation and think around work and the book.
I was really excited to read your book when it came out, and with the second anniversary of the Shaheen Bagh protests coming up, I wanted to be able to delve into that moment with you, since you spent so much time there as a citizen and as an artist, as an educator. So maybe I thought we could just begin with, your journey to this point. I know that you studied philosophy and art history at university, which is something that I was also really intrigued by because I have the same background. And I kind of wanted to know more about, your engagement with those disciplines and the way in which they informed your artistic work. Your MPhil dissertation was on the history of feminist graphic narratives in India, right? So how do you think that your scholarship has impacted your artistic practice and the way in which you think about images as somebody who also makes them?
Definitely. I mean, I think there's having chosen to, as you're saying, there's philosophy, art history, and then the practice of drawing and creating graphic narratives. And I've chosen to be interdisciplinary and have that education. And I think primarily, first of all, what it does is this kind of providing oneself with a multiplicity of registers. You're not receiving information in one way, but constantly thinking in various ways of what's happening around as a researcher, as an artist, as somebody who's thinking through, say, a text that one has read, and all these associations come together to first of all think of where we are today. What is the contemporary moment? What are we doing with things like just the identity of citizenship, with the unfolding very oppressive structures of state apparatus? What do all these mean? So even thinking of philosophy, which was my undergrad, I often go back to things like philosophy of language as use in Wittgenstein, and what does that mean vis-a-vis nationhood and the changing definitions that we're seeing today. What does creating language and folding that into oppression, how does that work? What are the mechanisms, right? And then also the ways of knowing. So thinking of feminist phenomenology and just how do you tackle the processes by which you know. So there's all of that, but I also think that being in campuses like Delhi University or JNU, and you've been at JNU as well, so I think we'd all understand what that means is not just the classroom at all. there's so many more things that are happening. So, for instance, being at Delhi University, there were many, at that time at least, there were many student organizations which were not affiliated to any one college, but were coming together to do other things that are not in the classroom. So, for example, as part of this group called Perspectives, which was going out into spaces where there's no news really coming out, but things are happening. For example, absolute drought in Bundelkhand. The years I was in DU, that was one of this major drought was ongoing, and it's happening, but there isn't enough information. So what can one do as a student beyond the classroom? How do students collect and say, okay, we are going to find ways of knowing that are not just given to you, that are not just student teacher relationships? And these are the kind of things that happen, solidarities that are formed in campuses. Then at JNU, it was also it was 2015 to 17 while I was at JNU, and that was the administration was becoming extremely oppressive. Just at that, it had hit hard. So these talks around nationalism that were happening, all of those are very much what inform the process of being in a campus like JNU. And those are directly what you kind of work with after that. I mean, there's no when if I'm working as an artist, it doesn't mean that there's only this process of working with material. It's constantly being informed by registers that you've come away with, of how do you receive, how do you critically examine what's happening, what you're doing. And then of course there's the next bit of like, how do you then engage with, how do you strategically sort of say, okay, this is what I can do with the world. Do I work with activists? Do I work with on ground community organizations, schools? How does one do these kind of associations in various ways? There's so many ways of working, and one doesn't have to do only one thing. So yeah, I feel like this interdisciplinary format of not just thinking but then also of actively engaging is something that for me is has to be that way, and it's been that way through education as well.
Yeah, I think you raised some really important points. I think, especially about the value of university campus as a site for building the habits of citizenship, of good citizenship, or building the values that are in line with our vision for a republic or a democracy. And if you could, speak to us a little bit about the materials and methods and the models of, drawing that you use in your work, since you use a variety of media, both digital and analog. I know. Maybe you could talk to us about that.
Yeah. So in terms of just material and how I kind of work around it, this first just, a lot of just drawing and sketchbooks and paper. And I really go back to this drawing, say, even in the space of sitting at the protest. It's often drawings within that time period of being in a particular space, often intimacy and immediacy of that. So these are sketches which really I return to in the process, even if it's moved away from it. So keeping those first sketches is really, really important to me till the end. And they're often drawings with a little bit of text. I'm noting down details of, say, what somebody might be wearing, or what is with the person. Are they holding something? Is there a particular gesture? Are there, in the context of, say, in Shaheen Bagh, were there posters that I feel, so actually visuals that I'm going to make which are of visuals, right? And how much of this backdrop information is just going to sit there, is going to let the reader's eyes rest on. There's the storyboarding, that's again, a lot of, I really like working analog, and which is a lot of these papers that come together that then compile to form some sort of book. I also honestly, I really like working with color, and this to have the book at a price that's not enormous. I've had to be black and white, and I also actually really like that it has this quality that's almost, for me, the immediacy of drawing. The size also was important for me. It's a small sized book that can sort of be carried around, can be put into a bag, can be handed out, can be taken to spaces. So that portability and that size, the immediacy to the drawing itself. But in that process, I actually sit with, often with color, and do these sort of overflows that happen of just painting actually, and for me it's important to be able to do that, which doesn't result in the book at all or anything to do with the book, but is a space to also just let thought happen. I feel they're like footnotes, sets of watercolors that are not going to go anywhere. They're not for anyone. They're part of that process because I'm telling you about the process, right? And then it's slowly bringing these drawings of the book to I work with, because the text has to come in. I use fonts that I'm not actually handwriting, but are digital editions, right? So I've got the pencil version of notes, and then I'm going to work on softwares to bring this together. And so there's this digital process, and using also drawing digitally with on the iPad. There's Procreate, which really you kind of drawing on this surface. So yeah, I'm not averse to using a mix of media. I don't think that it has to all be original paintings that then have to be scanned, and I have to have a set of just originals that are there. That's not where I come from either my training as an artist, or I am always open to experimenting, and so it's a mix of things. And finally, there's a lot of design that also goes into graphic narratives, right? There's a lot of page layouts that has to. So when I finish drawing my last page, I have a feeling of, oh, this is done. And then there's this anticlimax of a long period of design when you feel the book is done and it's not done. So in this case, I was able to actually work with the designer a lot, and that was important. And then there's the forward, there's bibliography, there's various components to the project that are after the drawing is done, and those are really important for me to be also a part of. And then there is people who are reviewing the writing blurbs for the book, and how do you bring that in. And that also honestly, to build that conversational nature of this book, it was important to have others having seen it. So yeah, so there's this, it takes all of this movement between materials.
When I was reading the book as well, I found that what you talked about in terms of interdisciplinarity is really it really comes through in the way in which there are these elements of news reportage, oral history, and social commentary that inform Shaheen Bagh, a graphic recollection. They are quite different registers in the sense that you move between a journalistic chronicling of what was happening and intimate conversations with the women protagonists and leaders of Shaheen Bagh, for example, or even ordinary women who did extraordinary things as part of the protest space and across generations and across various subjectivities. So I was also curious about, how you developed the tone for the book that straddles these different modes, especially since you have talked about this kind of concern with being able to work out the way in which language works in public life, right? Especially, when you're talking about Wittgenstein and his language games, the way in which rhetoric is mobilized these days by powerful groups and oppressive groups against minorities, against marginalized communities. Words acquire a certain kind of dangerous force and violence. And Shaheen Bagh was a moment in which you really saw the collision of different languages of citizenship, different languages of ambitions for the state kind of come together. And you see that in your book as well, because you're moving through all of these different spaces. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you developed that tone and how you mustered these different kinds of ways of throwing or projecting voices?
No, that's interesting. It's an interesting, really kind of interesting trajectory of thinking of how between language to what you're saying of how the book comes together. So, towards the beginning, right in the beginning of the protest, when the police brutality happened at Jamia, the protest started off there. And one was, like many others, I was going to the protest at Jamia. And one day it was kind of, I followed a group of people into Shaheen Bagh. I'd heard there are protests that are women led. I didn't know where exactly it is. Of course, right from the onset, even when in the first week when there was just about 40, 50 women sitting and no stage, there's just that group of women, the sense of this being a Muslim women led protest site was just enormously powerful, right? And the visuality of this highway, this enormous highway that connects Delhi to Noida, having been stopped of its daily traffic and taking that public space over for democratic dialogue, which also had children doing their games and play and a few carpets, and then somebody also sitting and knitting. All of that process was just so powerful as a way of coming together, of collecting, of taking over public space, of then having dialogues that's not just against the CAA, but from the beginning are also talking about directions that democracy should take. So, right from the onset, I think one of the biggest ways of being there for somebody who's not from there is to just listen deeply and be present too. And I think that is something that the protest site at Shaheen Bagh and many other protest sites that opened up in the anti-CA movement allowed for, was the possibility of many communities coming in, listening deeply first of all, and then also being able to participate in multiple ways. So this bit, I feel like right in the beginning, was just in an enormous amount of just being present too, but then feeling right in the beginning, feeling that this is a protest site that's happening, that it doesn't have actually media attention. Right in the beginning there wasn't any, it was just women sitting. So one responds to things like this in various capacities, right? There are people who are writing, there's people who make theater and poetry, and me, it was carrying my sketchbook around, which is usually how I work and move in life, and sitting at the protest site and just making these really quick pencil drawings of what somebody's saying, a conversation that I'm having with somebody sitting next to me, not just about the protest, but what have they, done in the day before arriving at the protest site at say 3 p.m. Yeah, so these kind of little conversations, and then the things that one is hearing on stage, and make jotting these down as little drawings. And then towards the later part of the protest, in say mid-Jan and towards Feb, I had started having these longer. There were friends in the protest side, people living in Shaheen Bagh, my age, older. Who I was speaking and having longer conversations with, and there's a curiosity to know. You want to know what people are thinking about, say, the success of a movement, because it's not just anymore about the repeal of CA. Yes, that is a primary demand, but then there's various voices and opinions about what the government should be doing. How do you listen to the people? What is unemployment? What has demonetization done? So this meant having longer conversations, and that was something again that I could do and was happening. And at the same time, it also was a conversation that started with the publisher, Arpita, saying, listen, would you want to bring this together and look at what it means to thread moments together and have more engagement with the process of learning and understanding what has shaped this and what is it, the many folds of a movement. So, so I think that then meant moving between research, this active deep listening, and being present too in more ways, like talking to more people, but then also continuously just drawing. And then, when you're kind of moving between this, moving between text, between listening, between recordings and drawings, I feel like the language of graphic storytelling is able to hold the tussle between all of this and not let it rest in some sort of finality, and that then becomes just a beautiful image, but remain with the push and the pull between, say, just even text and visuals, but also not telling whole pictures. And that's something that very early on was obvious while making the book, was not that this book or any book can encase the entirety of something as enormous as protests that happened against the CAA and that have influenced the course of people's movements, but that the threading together of moments is ways of retrieving and re-entering conversations. So if it's that, then this burden of giving entire pictures, entire stories is not the attempt. And so, what is it if it's not also representational in entirety, but you're pulling out, breaking down moments, you're breaking down what happened there visually, the engagement, that conversation, and also realigning various moments at time. What happened earlier, what happened after, memories of that space many years before. So this kind of movements in time, the play with between visual and image, the play between what is can be and what is referring to what happened but not in entirety. All of these are sort of these dynamics within which the grammar of graphic storytelling sort of allows for and doesn't give closures to. So you often, I mean, I feel the sense of providing or giving the space, giving locators to somebody who might read to also enter and bring in their own associative memories and associative ways of telling the story that now is parts of which are here. And so I feel like every time I'm doing this, for me, I'm learning what to do, and so it's also a process that for me is really engaging, in what can be done while I'm at it, while I'm trying to understand and grapple with the many things that are entering and are being dropped out of the frame as well.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because when you were talking, I kept thinking of like somebody conducting a symphony, almost like there's this orchestration of many different voices that you're doing, of course, in graphic form. And it also struck me that, and I was going to ask you this, and you answered some of it just now, but how, like, I wanted to know how you arrived at the form of graphic nonfiction to record the events following the anti-CAA NRC protests, and what it was about the Shaheen Bagh moment in particular that propelled that might propel one to choose illustration as a mode of documentation. I'm asking this also because to me it also seems like, and we know this, right, we live in a very image saturated culture, and lens based visual practice has sort of dominated reportage, let's say, since the 19th century, especially because of its representational force. There's this kind of at least commonsensical correspondence between what's happening and what you see, right? I mean, we understand that that's a very vexed relationship, but just in terms of how we immediately think about it, what do you think that these older artistic technologies, like pen, pencil, and ink, bring to the act of witnessing? I guess I'm pushing you a little bit, pushing the answer that you just gave, which set up sort of some of this conversation. But when you talked about the open-ended nature of it, for example, I was wondering if I could push you to maybe just talk a little bit about that. That what is it exactly that allows the viewer to come inside in a way that is not permitted really by technologies like photography or cinema or video?
Hmm. Yeah, right. I really like the comparison, the relationship with symphony. I think that's really interesting because between comics and music and also architecture, there's actually a lot of these kind of comparisons and relationships that have been drawn between how you kind of map spaces and build spaces, and then the rhythm that comics allow for. And so, yeah, I really like that sort of relationship that you're drawing. I think coming to finding this form and why I feel like it was something that I could work with. I feel like in a way there is a very practical relationship. I do draw from the archive of just even citizens who were at the protest and taking photos, taking videos, or and then journalists. One also directs oneself to the kind of media that one would learn from and read. There's a lot of media that is, just presenting protests as instances to just actually say what the government wants. So it's really choosing. There's also a very, there's a plethora of the kinds of media that one finds. It's not all the same thing. So I feel like there's a very direct relationship in how, while working, I am, seeking out images, and there are friends who are photographers who are there, and I think that there has to always actually be a multiplicity of creative production when things like this happen. And I feel like each of those, whether it's there's photography, there's posters, there's poetry, there was theater, there were so many things even within the movement while the movement was going on. There was libraries, there was puppeteers. I remember Anurupa Roy was at Shaheen Bagh creating these enormous cardboard puppets. There were murals, students of Jamia that were creating murals. a lot of these creative productions happen within the folds of the movement itself. I mean, one can also, of course, say the entirety of lens-based practice versus graphic narratives. There are relationships or comparisons one can draw, but I find it more interesting to actually look at what a particular journalist has been able to do. I feel like while drawing, I feel like there is this constant tussle between, yes, the act of doing uh, what looks like record keeping, what is therefore likened to reportage, and when, say, graphic artists, graphic narrativists like Joe Sacco, they claim that space and say that what they're doing is graphic reportage and it's graphic journalism. But there is an obvious artistic impulse with which the work is happening. It isn't that this was is definitely a claim that's there. There is, yes, Shaheen Bagh happened, but it isn't that this was as was. There's a lot of picking and dropping and choosing. There's also various points at which there's just reimagining things that weren't completely there. There's history and bits of just a conversation with, say, the lead character, with the character Shahana, which is of memories that even she doesn't remember. So there's parts to the story that aren't evidence keeping, and for me that's really, really important. It's also, honestly, when the project, like making the book, was over more than a year, and to sustain that process creatively actually is within that tussle, within what you kind of are imagining and reconfiguring. And then this bit of looking at reports, looking at images as was, looking at various voices, talking and doing interviews. And I wouldn't want to completely try to claim either of those spaces or let that argument rest. At other points, there's things that you're trying to be true to a certain event or a day that happened, a speech that happened, and you can't visually represent bits of it because it's not possible for one or the other reason. So I feel like this is what carries through the experiment. This kind of yes, representation, but also pushing at what representation means. And if one picks up the book and says, yes, of course, this is illustrative of a movement, and for me, that's not how I think of it at all. I don't want it to. It doesn't feel to me like an illustration of a report. It's in fact like the visuals are not illustrative. It's actually for me a language that develops, that is then not drawing something that's otherwise already told, but is a language of its own. And graphic storytellers will say that the visuals is not illustrative of the text or of a thing that happened, but is formulating a grammar that's unique, right? So the capacities of that are something that I in process want to push, and not just say this is just as was and trying to stay true to an event, a source, or a real time situation, but try and actually play with what storytelling, or what also the continuation of conversations. If drawing and all these creative productions are part of the folds of a movement, then those begin there. The first page of this book is not where the story begins, and nor is the last page where the conversation ends. So how much can productions like this, and many others, how can they be extensions to conversations that are urgent and happen at the movement at various sites, but continue to need to, at this point that we're at.
Yeah, I think that you made a very important point about how we also tend to read a lot of contemporary chronicles in terms of evidence, almost as a kind of over determining paradigm, right? Even within lens based practices, we know that they've moved on beyond this kind of evidentiary aspiration. I think also I really like the point you made about this, about the autonomy of form itself, right? That the graphic or the visual language or vocabulary that is mobilized by an artist, that has its own kind of expressive value. it kind of is able to make something new that is not just about showing something that happened, or just something that or recording something that happened, which is often what a lot of this kind of work gets read as, and does disservice to the aesthetic behind it as well. Like in this case, the book exceeds and is exceeded by the protest, and they're sort of mutually constituted, right? As well, and you see it when you're reading the book. And I was also thinking that, what you touched upon, just to kind of focus on the book a little bit in terms of its structure as well, just so that our audience knows. I'll talk a little bit about what the book structure. That it's in four parts and it's in four chapters broadly. They are open fields, collecting, the many Shaheen Baghs, and ashes and after. Those are the four sections, right? And the book takes us on a journey from the settlement of the area of Shaheen Bagh through the incident of police violence that happened at the neighborhood university, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the original organizing of the protest at Shaheen Bagh, to the eruption of similar protests across India, and then the post COVID-19 aftermath that unfolded in those localities. I think that the contemporaneity of the book, and this is kind of again, this kind of tension between a sort of patent idea of record keeping and what a graphic narrative can actually do in terms of encapsulating a moment or a mood. I think that tension really it sits at this on this notion of contemporaneity, because the story is unfolding in real time, even as it has so much historical and sociological context behind it. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, your process of planning the various chapters as an extension of what you just, explained to us. What did you choose to highlight? What did you choose to leave out? Or what did you think were the most apt kind of, maybe images, maybe conversations, maybe sort of, moments that are not really visible, but that you render visible? And that's something that you, I think, meant, right, when you were saying that it's not just something you see and you draw.
Hmm.
It's much more than that. So could you give us a glimpse into that process?
Yeah, thanks for that arrangement of, ideas again. And this, especially about what to do with tackling the now, the moment that one is in, that kind of telling of a story that's not long ago in history, but is actually unfolding, and the politics of which is, urgent realities, even as we talk today. And yet, what does one do? Not letting it render one silent, but actually being able to respond and engage and return to. Yeah, so in terms of just bringing this sort of structure in, as you're saying, the sections, the flow of it, as we were saying, going through just that process, initially there's a lot of listening, and there's interviews, there's a lot of just asking and questioning and talking to people. And that's a process that I really, as a researcher, I really, it piques my curiosity, and I really want to sit and listen and have those conversations unfold in the ways that they unfold, and that again, as somebody who's creating a graphic narrative, not returning to a newsroom, I can do this. I can have long unwinding conversations and let them take their flow, and from those often say, there's somebody who will be talked about, who then I'm going to go meet and talk to, and then from that person another person, and even different sites. So this trajectory of research itself, in the process of engaging right in the beginning of the production of this longer, year and a half long process, is in itself open ended to being receptive to where a conversation will go. Yeah. And then what I was doing was also at the same time putting together reports, talking to, say, a friend who's taken lots of photographs there to collect those, my own first initial drawings, bringing all these elements, to a space to be able to look at this plethora of ways of reading, ways of knowing. And I think this bit of what we're saying of evidence making, I want to just think around it a little more, of not just like what is it that we find and arrive at, but how do we know? And how many ways can we know? Because these registers with which we're thinking then should shape the ways that we're then processing and engaging with information. And graphic narratives can be one of those ways that is an alternative trajectory to how you process, and that's really interesting, right? To push at the boundaries of that. So yeah, so with all these various elements, these texts and images, I kind of bring this together, and then there's this process of storyboarding and looking at, yes, there has to be a way to enter this, and this is not an infographic. I think there's a couple of these clear ideas of what the alignment and the thread of entering the process has to be, and what it's not. And so if it's not just information, if there is so many reports that are out there, what more? What is it that I don't know? What is it that I'm asking? What is it that when I sit in an interview and I'm talking to Atia or the other activists, what are the questions that I'm trying to ask, and how can that stay? How can I not kind of lose that and say, oh, that's the information I've got, and now I'm going to present this clean report which doesn't show you the journey? But how far can you kind of just stay with that attempt? It was important for me to begin with this with the character with Shahana, who's there, Shaheen Bagh, who's from Shaheen Bagh, a young Muslim woman who's an architect designer, have her presence be there to lead. And then so there are characters that emerge, and those are important. I kind of then hold on to that, but then there's a lot of moving back and forth in bringing the information together in that storyboarding. And so there's practically there's a whole book of A4 sheets that come together by the end of that storyboarding process, that are just that could not make sense to anyone, honestly. They're full of little thumbnail drawings, which are just 1 inch by 1 inch boxes that stand for every page. And in each of those boxes there are little sections and many notes, and so there's a whole book of that that makes no sense to anybody but it's honestly where the logic of this, and as you're going back to that comparison to symphony, where a slow rhythm comes in. And I would say that I do hold on to narrative because I feel the need for that, especially in books like this. I feel like I push at that, and I find myself wanting to question and ask what narrative means, because you kind of stay with the comfort of cause and effect and story. But in this case, there were things that I need to have presenced. There are things that need to be said, so that rhythm allows for then the conversation to unfold. So slowly through that storyboarding, it emerges symbiotically when I'm kind of putting the information together. It's also responding. You're being told by the process how much can be held.
So that's how you came to structure the book as you did.
So there is a bit of this beginning, there is a leading into, there is this history of what Shaheen Bagh was before the settlement of what we know it as while going into it today. What were the, before 90s, it was actually just open agricultural land. What is that memory of the geography of a city that is so hard to see and think of today in that densely populated space? So, this memory, that bit of history of partition history, which is very strong for families that are in Shaheen Bagh, whose predecessors say we did not go at partition, we stayed. So, how does one reimagine? And in this, there's a lot of reimagining of the drawing scapes, right? These are not things that I'm returning to or seeing photographs of. So there's a lot of play with just visually reimagining. And at this point, there's also actually, it was interesting to show these drawings, show this to people that I'm talking to. And that's not, I wouldn't say that that's the only way, but that's one way. I like to converse even in process. And the friends one has and one is talking to, they're very much part of that process. So I could do that. And that was very nice for me to actually be able to have that continue. And then there's, it's not just one location. Shaheen Bagh is in one place, but there are the many Shaheen Baghs that opened out. There are many sites. It's something that triggered protests across not just the country, but the world. So, what does that mean? That Shaheen Bagh is not just a location physically, but is many spaces, many places, is a way of thinking that's emerging. It's a way of thinking of public space, of the geography of the city, but also of what protest culture is. What minority communities taking the lead, in this case, Muslim women taking the lead in protest, what does that mean for all protests to come? For ways of thinking of citizenship and nationhood. So all of this bit of unfolding and letting the many Shaheen Baghs trying to have that section of the narrative was definitely something that I felt needs to come in, so that we're not stuck to a locator, one place, one space. And then I feel like the towards the fourth section, what happened in Delhi, at the northeast Delhi, the riots that happened. It's genocide. It's state sponsored,
Yeah, I mean,
state
we know it's a
exact.
pogrom. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, what do you do with representing and bringing that into the fold? Not saying yes, all movements are going to lead to violent protests and genocide. That's not the relationship. But this happened. This is happening. This is part of the government's response to protest. So this, was important again to bring in, and yet have it all of this through conversation. It's not, I think it was really important in process, and for me with the book, is that it's not replicating just reports and things that are there and one already has a plethora of. It's, and as you were saying also, the medium can do many more things. The medium in itself is conversational. So how do we use that ability, that malleability of it, to converse with information and extend that conversation, try and critique, try and build one's urge to think beyond also. So again, coming to just like that wrapping of that fourth section, where the book, the last pages of what is the book. Of course, this, it's a body. The book has its first page and its last, but I feel like that again, returning to what we were talking about, there can be no wrapping up or finality to something that's ongoing. So instead, I feel like what was important to come to towards the last bit was, what does the success of people's movements mean? And that's something that came up in many conversations, which I didn't see this coming out. I didn't already think it would happen while doing an interview. Was people saying, it isn't just about, yes, the CAA still needs to be repealed, but that's not the only way that we think of what happened at Shaheen Bagh. Shaheen Bagh has changed the way that we think of India, the way that we can claim citizenship, the way that the Muslim community was able to find this solidarity and come forward like never before. Muslim women speaking up like never before, and that's changed, the course of history, and how citizenship can be viewed in permanent ways, and also the nature of public space. The what is, Shaheen Bagh suddenly coming into the geography of the city, into vocabulary of, not just people from Shaheen Bagh speaking up, but all sorts of communities coming in, Sikhs from Punjab, students, activists, scholars from various universities. There's women from Assam talking about detention centers, all converging at this site. So then Northeast Delhi, there are many protest sites again at Muslim majority communities and localities. These transformations are ways to think of the success of what movements are, And this was something that came out a lot very strongly in conversations. It wasn't something that I was, trying to redeem, a movement that's maybe not met its central demand while lockdown has been imposed, but something that's coming out very strongly. And so, towards the end, that's really where the last pages are, of trying to think of the successive movements and the demands of a movement in multiplicity, and and that conversation again, it still continues. So so that's kind of bringing that conversation not to a close, but to its last pages.
Think that, I found myself also thinking when you were talking about like staying with the contemporary in these ways, you know s- being with these voices, with these ideas, with these experiences of people that you were then transmuting in as an artist onto the page. And something else that you said struck me as really important, just this kind of that the graphic narrative can be really plastic in terms of what it allows you, right? And as far as like spatial and temporal arrangements go. I mean, I'm looking at your book. I mean, there are panels that are very self contained, and there are pictures that are sort of drifting loosely across the page. There are these iconic scenes that we know from certain, photographs from the protests, but also private moments that the viewers can't have seen, that you witnessed, and through which you've drawn out individual memories. And there are events that you had to zoom out of, like almost like a drone shot, let's say, and or have had to reconstruct, like the violence that happened during the partition. That is also sort of referenced in the book, alluded to in the book. And then there are moments where that you stretch out through close-ups. I'm thinking of like this scene where there are paper boats that you linger on through an entire page. So you're moving between these different time periods and spaces. How did you make decisions regarding movement in the book? And I'm also curious because you talked about storyboarding, for example. I'd love to know how sort of graphic narrative departs from, let's say, animation or cinematic strategies. Like how does movement work on the page versus on the screen? So I mean, can you shed light on that?
Yeah, right. That's very interesting. I think just to begin with, the relationship between storyboarding for a graphic narrative or in comics versus and its relationship to storyboarding for animation. I'm of course not an animator, but I have, this conversation comes up a lot within comics makers and even with people who do animation. And actually, what happens within the storyboarding format for when one is doing comics, what you're going to arrive at is the space of pages, and you're going to have. I mean, of course, you can also have scroll down comics in on digital platforms. But in both cases, you are going to be moving your eyes across the space of either screen or the book, and you're going to turn pages. So your panels are physically kind of leading you across space of the pages, and you move when you look, yes, there's the predominant visual characteristic of the page itself. And I do think that comics and graphic narratives are first visual. Even the arrangement of text, there's a lot of visual play in how big the text is, where is the text. You see it first. And there's a lot of play in that arrangement. And then, even where a page is turning, or the possibility of having a spread of two pages suddenly unfold and let the reader kind of enter that and just be with that as a bigger locator and marker. So this is this movement that happens across physical space, right? And the storyboarding of that is very attuned to the movement that's going to take place towards the end of it, within a particular panel, within a page, and then within that longer set of pages. And actually, in the storyboarding, laying it out, I would think of the entirety of pages even on one page, try and actually build little thumbnails of many pages in just one page. And when drawing it out, I would also at points take prints of sections and lay that out on a floor, trying to see this as a big spread. What does it mean in space when you have all of these kind of laid out? What's happening? What's happening visually? What's happening to style? Because if you're with a work over a period of time, over a year and a half, even your relationship with the visual language is going to change. So I mean, some of this would
Yeah.
be, I mean, I can tell when I look at the book that I'm doing things differently with the grammar. What happens with animation, that kind of storytelling in cinema, is that you're actually staying with that physical space of one screen, one space, and you're moving in time. So it's an entirely different space time equation that you begin with and that you're encased in.
Right. Yeah, I see. So in terms of your process, could you take us through specific pages maybe to give us a window into it?
And I feel like there are these pages, if I can refer to, like, for example, there's this page that is on the 37 page in the book. It's where a particular conversation with a family member of the lead character, Shahana, whose family, who we now know by this time. She's led us into the story. We've talked with her. Now there's this point in the second section where we're now looking at the question is, how did the first days of the protest, how did they unfold when police brutality at Jamia happened? What was happening? What did you feel? What was happening in the house? How do you respond at the immediacy of attack like this, right? And so in this page, for instance, there's in the background one has this television that's blaring, and there is this bit of the representation of evidence, this bit of doing as was things as was, and trying to provide locators for somebody
Hmm.
who might have read news, so you can
Yeah.
relate, you can have associative memories too. And so that is, this bit is, text is verbatim. You sort of read the report, put in the text of 51 students who are injured, being led to hospital. And I have references, also at the back of this book, which are a way that one tries to build evidence making as process, kind of put that across, evidence of evidence, right? So that bit's there, but then there is the relationship with that to the character who's in this page, which is an oldish woman. In this case, it's the character Shahana's grandmother, who's sitting at the table and making a list of grocery items that she's going to now order on the phone. And she's just, before this, we know she's also said that I'm not going to go down to the shop here and get, because there are many people who are going to have to go down to the shop and get groceries. And this response is her response to tackling and strategizing and doing a first organization when hearing attack. Then we also have the news of protest at ITU happening later the same day, juxtaposed with a conversation with a grocery man. There is, in one way, absolutely nothing to do with this. She's not saying, "Oh, this is what I feel," or "Oh, this is what's going to happen," but organizing. And for me, these kind of arrangements of thought, visual, memory construction, and evidence is important, because they push at each other, but also because we're dealing with something that is national laws, yes, but in its relationship to the everyday. And that's something that came out so strongly at sites like Shaheen Bagh, where Muslim women are coming out and saying, this is how it affects our life in our children, our students in Jamia, and this is everyday reality. And also visually looking at within the book, you also mentioned this move between the personal and these little conversations, reimagining to say, on later pages, like on page 253, there's, you enter this kind of double spread where there is a visual of how we often have seen the protest. There's an ocean of people. It isn't about one single conversation, but is allowing one to rest with what is this enormous gathering of thousands and tens of thousands of people, and is very visually strong as what happened at some of those nights at the protest. And it's been represented, and yet drawing it out for me is significant, because you kind of think of what a response while being at the protest night after night is. You think of returning to that sense of being there, not just the history of it, but that this sense of its presence is in continuous. It's not over, when even if space closes up. Yeah, so there's in the course of that journey, one
Hmm.
moves between these various ways of bringing things together.
Right. Yeah, and I also, wanted to ask, because we talked about it, and you mentioned earlier as well that it was also your interest in feminist epistemology and standpoint theory that kind of informed some of the ways in which you took up a project like this, or arrived at it, I suppose, over a period of years, as one does. I read Umar Khalid's review of your book In the Caravan, and he writes that by foregrounding their voices and lived experiences, you are able to capture a critical moment in the Muslim experience in India when something seemed to fundamentally change for the worse. I was really curious about your own concerns and strategies as you navigated this tricky issue of subject position, as a Hindu citizen telling the story. I understand that this is a formulation that can often be used quite reductively by bad actors, and it's uncomfortably close to an oppressive ruling regime's attempts to define us as citizens. And of course, this fight is as much one of Republican values, as we've been belaboring through this conversation, and something that is shared by us all, including farmers and workers, Bahujan and Adivasi communities, as it is against majoritarian violence unto Muslims and other minorities. But at the same time, we, the two of us, for example, as caste Hindu women, occupy a position of immense privilege. So, can you talk a little bit about how you tackled the challenge of making visible the story of Shaheen Bagh as citizen, artist, and someone with that socio-political advantage?
Yeah, right. I think that's a very important question, and it's definitely one that has to provide a self-reflective register in the process, no, from the onset, and definitely something that came up in various conversations that I was having with the publisher, with Arpita, with Yoda Press. How does one build the ethics of storytelling? It's also something that comes up always when one begins something that is representational, is documentary in any form, right? It's age old questions, but that doesn't mean that they then become old at all, and especially in the urgency and the context of where we are right now. And actually, right now, when we're having this recording, we've in the week of gatherings of really fascist orders where the Hindu right-wing groups have collected. There's akhadas, there's all sorts of religious heads which are guiding the government,
Calls to
collecting,
genocide.
yeah, which are gathering in these religious sites in Haridwar, etc., and claiming that the nation has to rise, Hindus have to rise to force genocide as a way of claiming this nation for what it's essentially supposed to be. So, what does it mean to remain silent? There is no space to remain sort of silent in, and there's also, as you say, rightly saying, you can't kind of say you can't disown an identity which gets you through this country, so what one can do is to try and find these self-reflective and critical lenses with which one then is able to delve into process. And for me, one of those strategies was to have many people sort of involved. It was very important to me, honestly, to have conversations as much as possible, to also return with whatever is created. So even if it's, a draft, who can see this? Can Ghazala Jamil, who's written the forward for the book and is a scholar of Muslim women's rights, post-partition, and the history of Muslim women and representation in the country. Can she look at this, and what are the ways that I can take through feedback of what people are saying, who need to see work like this before it's just out there. So that as process, how can you kind of provide yourself with strategies? And this is not I don't have to invent these. So that's also good. There are people I can speak with, and having that kind of effort for me was really, really important. Having a multiplicity of voices, older scholars, young people at Shaheen Bagh, activists from outside Shaheen Bagh who were very much part of the movement. Then having Yoda Press, having the publishers team, which was really supportive of the process. In how many ways can they also be part of this process, not just seeing it at the end, but with a book that also was it was key that it comes out not too far into the future. After lockdown, there's this kind of urgency of continuing the space of protest, and things like a book can become a locator for conversation. So can this come out soon, which means that more people need to be involved. Publishers has to be on board with conversations from the get-go. And for me, these collaborative strategies of working are something that are not making things more difficult. It actually really helps in that process. Yeah, and so I think to be able to critically examine and then listen, do that act of deep listening, and definitely no way to stay silent. I don't think to be complicit with what is happening with the creation of fascist right-wing Hindu nation that's happening as we speak. Remaining silent is to be complicit.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that's something that this podcast, Artalap, is also committed to. We're a visual culture podcast, but As we know, everything happens within a context and not in a vacuum. So, what I try to do is weld questions of aesthetics and art history with matters of political and moral urgency, precisely for the reasons that you just mentioned. And I think that, on that note, I also wanted to ask you about, your work as an art based educator and member of library movements as well. How do you see the book's life as part of a canon that is making a political vocabulary and consciousness available to young people, or as a kind of pedagogical text? What about the book do you think appeals to children and adolescents, teenagers, who in a sense are already becoming aware and radicalized? When I was watching some of the TikTok, the spate of TikTok agitprop that was, being produced at the time was really incredible. These are very vulnerable young people. They want to kind of, stake their claim, on the nation in a way that they think is most empowering for them. So, how do you think that, being a teacher or a facilitator shaped the way in which you wrote or created Shaheen Bagh, a graphic recollection?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that kind of part of what I do in as well. I honestly, this bit that it's spoken to children and young people, school going age group has responded to the book and wanted to read it, is something that I found surprisingly, nice to know. And because it wasn't a consideration, it was not an age group that I thought this book is for at all, even though I do work with young people and children. Yeah, it's surprisingly nice to know that. And as you're saying, there's this libraries network that the book has been part of, and it's gone to. There's an organization, Bookworm, that actually sends books out to various libraries, and then librarians gather and kind of converse around books. While having a talk with them and a panel discussion with them, it was something that they informed me of, was that this book for ages 9 and above is where they keep it in their section in the libraries. And these are libraries across the country, in communities in where there's a lack of good education, and a lot of children want to read it. There's this. Also, because it's just visuals, it seems like it's not a children's story, but is for children. So that's, yeah, it's been interesting to think of it. I didn't consciously plan it. I thought it's much more for the age group that's there, activists, university students, and then older people who are thinking about and writing about, and also able to build the conversations, as you were saying with Omar's review, that kind of bit of how do you actually use the book and build the conversation, not just review it. So that's kind of the engagement which I hoped for. But also, I feel like it's interesting how much children were part of the movement. As you're saying, they're all there. If families are at the protest, there's going to be many children who are there at every protest. I not just Shaheen Bagh. I was at, as a Hosrani. There's just so many children, and there's this kind of festive sense to it. There's a joy to it, and that joy has to be there for movements to sustain over time. And then there's a lot of creativity. The children are drawing, and they're drawing all sorts of things. It's the amazing bit of when children are drawing is that it's not just limited to the onus of representation, but are these wild imagination of the prime minister, and who is he, what is he saying, what does he look like, imagination of what the flag means. And these are essential to think beyond the binaries and oppositions, and just being stuck with trying to tweak what is and trying to push it what is, to what do we dream. And that's something that I come to a lot as a educator working within communities, again, where all the work I do with my organization with Outreach is to work within spaces that don't have the access to education as one should. Under-resourced communities where there's either no school or care homes which are for children and young people off the street. So this kind of tackling of your identity, your imagination in the wildest of ways is something that young people are really able to do, right? And we, at some point, we're supposed to get over it and try and do things as is, or try and work with what is. And to return to that is really important. And so even these vocabularies develop. No, so even in the book, on the 101st page, there's a family scene. There's a mug of milk on the table, and somebody is telling the child, you need to drink your milk. And this is at the later stage. One knows protests are happening and children are involved. This is towards the end of the book, and the child in the frame is saying, the question is, drink your milk now, and the child is saying, no, we will fight, we will win, no CAA. And this
The
woman
anti-milk
being,
lobby will have
yes.
words.
So this sort of absurdity to communication, and how children are going to imagine and use. And the thing is that, I mean, this is not the only politicization that's happening. The textbooks in mainstream schools are highly politicized as well. So I think one of the kind of ruptures that happens is, that there's a right and wrong. There's a whole section, a page that talks of this lady whose child actually died at the protest. He was this newborn child. On this is on page 100, and it's this woman saying, yeah, my I was here with my infant, it was that important to me to be here. And there was a lot of complaints about it, the report saying, oh, this is too much, this protesters shouldn't do.
Right.
What would it have meant for a woman? And this conversation in the book is actually through the character, through Shahana, describing it and saying, I was really angry looking at the media reports about that woman, because she knew best. She knew best, she knows, and you can't judge. And so there's so many complications around childhood and protests. And I'm actually with my organization. I work still at Shaheen Bagh with activists who are there. There are, after the movement, there's been many solidarities that formed and have actually been used, have been tools of, through lockdown, through COVID. There's ways that activists were able to work together, and even now there are many initiatives born out of the movement of just of education. The complete failure of education in these past 2 years that we've seen, activists are gathering and doing these after school classes, just learning spaces right in communities like Shaheen Bagh, at Shaheen Bagh. So over there the questions still come up, and I'm doing like there's a session which is not about nationhood at all. Somebody will still bring in a slogan, bring in the flag in the middle of a drawing that's got nothing to do with that, and it leads to conversation because it's very urgent, it's immediate. The children know what's happening to this country. So there's no more the sensibility of, saving a childhood or a phase of age group that shouldn't talk about. These are if situations like this happen, there's no leaving people out, leaving young people out. They know, they're aware, they're asking questions. So I feel the possibility of engagement is there, and it's a happy surprise to know that the book is able to talk to that diversity of audience, honestly.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, if children are, if it's okay to kill children, if the state's fine killing children, then they have every right to be there in protests, right? So I think that that's a really important point to make as well, in terms of, how our education system already is so saffronized, and it's already, indoctrinating young people with the worst ideas and some very questionable values. So in this, all of this is a kind of counter to that. Works like yours are a counter to that. Who have been your influences or models as an artist working on a book like this? I wanted to ask you that also because you're a scholar of the graphic novel in India, and I was wondering if you could like contextualize your work in within that broader history as well.
It's really interesting to see the kind of work that's happening even in Bangladesh and Pakistan. There's graphic narratives coming out, and these alliances still are to be formed, between comics makers across countries, neighboring countries. But it's really interesting because one could trace a long lineage of visual storytelling and in the country, folk traditions, all of that. And I definitely am inspired by various methods of storytelling over historically. But I also feel like the grammar of this form is very much in the moment, and even the way that young I know artists are dealing with it are tapping into, say, just Instagram and social media, their websites that are for comics makers, using these to really stay within the conversations of now. And it's actually over the past year and a half or so, it's been amazing to see just like this rupture of how much really kind of well thought out posters, comics that are just like 4 panels maybe, from Dalit artists, from feminist activists, just putting out their work that may never be in print, but is really kind of well structured and well thought, and really looking at what comics can be. And what's interesting right now is that there's about a decade or so of slow work in, say, first a few print books. There was Amruta Patil's Kari that really opened out what women could do with the farm. They were very early works, eh? And then there's been works like compilation, like first-hand graphic nonfiction in India, that try to bring together a variety of stories which are nonfiction into one place, trying to say that this is something that's happening in the country. But it's still recent history. We can't kind of canonize this, and that's exciting, because what it means is that as somebody making comics and graphic narratives, trying to do these links between, say, a reportage, between critiques of the current, one can also play with what the form is going to become. But there is this amazing scope of defining. Every work at this point can define what the vocabulary within the country, within the subcontinent, what does it mean to respond to the contemporary with this medium, without having to say, oh, it has been this and this. In the West, you would say, yes, there's a history of graphic nonfiction that's actually there, but it's not here in this grammar that we find graphic narratives in. So yeah, and in terms of a little more of the influences, I think the graphic nonfiction, Joe Sacco's books of his aren't just content and things that one looks at. It's also as a maker. It's looking at it as a maker. So if I'm looking at Joe Sacco's Palestine or any of his other books, it's looking at the format, trying to decode what he's doing. You're literally like unraveling
Yeah.
the page. Yeah, because how else are you going to kind of, and that doesn't mean you want to copy it. That means you're just saying, okay, so this and then this and this. What you're doing.
Yeah, but he's a pioneer. He sort of set a template for what is
Yeah.
possible to do.
And then there are other books like Munnu by Sajjad
Yeah.
Malik, and that's graphic narrative of based on not telling one history of Kashmir, but his life and growing up and various standpoints of what Kashmir is. And this again the possibility of layered narratives that happen without trying to say this is a closure. This is one truth. There's one history. So this, and also the satire, that play, the humor, the characters that are animal representations, all of this, there's bits of humor that comes into when I'm telling the story here as well, and you use that. That's one of these effective tools which I am drawn to. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, it sounds like a really promising moment for South Asian graphic and bookmakers. I think that this way in which art is able to capture the contours of a moment is very important. It's very cathartic, and it allows for a certain kind of building of community of empathetic readers and viewers. So that's all very important. Thank you so much, Ita, for your time. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. It's been amazing to think through along with you, and thank you for inviting me and for doing this, carrying these conversations through. It's really exciting to have your platform.
Thank you for tuning into Artalap with Ita Mehrotra as we discussed her critically acclaimed graphic book, Shaheen Bagh, A Graphic Recollection, to mark the second year since the protests against the CAA and NRC, both of which, while still in force, continue to be rejected by all Indians who believe in the Constitution. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP.